nearly 38% of our city's population are foreign-born. If we add their children in, which I think is an advantageous group to recognize, nearly 60% of New York City's population are either immigrants or the children of immigrants. And so it's an incredibly robust audience in our city. What is important to understand about the economic reality of immigrants in our city is, in fact, that nearly 20% of all business income that's generated in the state of New York come from immigrant business owners. And nearly half of small businesses in the city are immigrant-owned, which is incredible. And in the state of New York, 25% of all businesses owned in the state are owned by immigrants, versus nationally, where that statistic is much smaller, it's actually half. So in the city of New York, we recognize the entrepreneurial spirit of immigrants, and we do all that we can to ensure that we support them. So I actually want to talk about certain initiatives that we have launched in the city that focus on how do we support and better connect our immigrant small business community to city services. The importance of how we make sure immigrants thrive in the city is critical. I would say the mayor has said this, but for us it's really important to recognize that when we invest in our immigrant communities, they invest in us. They invest in their city, they invest in their communities. They are, I would say, vitally important in our main streets as they are in our Wall Street. They, in fact, are the folks that make the engine of our city run and are critically important. So we recognize that we have to continue to help them build their business capacity, help their small businesses continue to grow and thrive. We need to make sure that we're connecting businesses and customers more effectively, and we need to make sure that business resources get supported more widely. So in 2011, Mayor Bloomberg had announced with our city's Economic Development Corporation, with my office, the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, and our city's Department of Small Business Services, 3 critical initiatives. And they were focused on enhancing small business services for immigrants by building their capacity. And through that, in fact, we have citywide presence through what the Department of Small Business Services runs is called Business Solution Centers. And the Business Solution Centers are there in communities to better support anyone who wants to start a small business. What we had learned, however, from immigrant small business owners through a survey process with them was that many weren't going to our Business Solution Centers because they weren't aware of them, the language capacity wasn't as rich as it needed to be. And so we partnered with community-based providers in key communities, in the Latino community, in the Russian community, in the South Asian community, to train them, and in the Korean and Chinese community, to train individuals in those community-based organizations to help them provide a series of workshops in the languages of the community. And then we took a number of materials of the city agency and translated them, all downloadable, all available. It's actually, that was the first phase. It was wonderfully successful. The second phase is actually focused on now going into translation of Urdu in Arabic and in Hindi. The first phase was focused on Korean, Chinese, Russian, and Spanish. The second phase is actually much broader. And I would say the critical reality of community-based organizations for us is really important, knowing that they are the ones that are in communities that interface with communities. The second initiative that I think is a really great one to talk about is a competition that was housed out of the city's Economic Development Corporation called Competition Thrive. And Competition Thrive was really, Thrive stands for, the acronym actually stands for, let me find it for you, to help reach immigrant ventures and entrepreneurs. And it was a partnership between the city's Economic Development Corporation, Baruch College's School of Business, the Zicklin School of Business, and it was funded by Deutsche Bank. The reason all of this is important is because it was actually some private monies that allowed us to go into our community-based audiences and say, who helps immigrants? Who's helping immigrant entrepreneurs? Who's helping immigrant small businesses? And how are you helping them? So it was a competition to acquire how they were helping them, better understand what they were doing, and then be able to understand what needs do they need, what help do they need. We were able to get back a really robust audience of who was doing this work, and then we funded 5 different, with small grants, 5 different community-based organizations working in a range of organizations. One of them, for example, was the Queens Economic Development Corporation that was working with, had traditionally worked with contractors in Queens, and they were working with Mandarin-speaking contractors who were doing construction work in Queens. This actually, what they were doing with them was training them to become licensed in the city and to take the licensing exam with our Department of Consumer Affairs in Mandarin. The city has a language access policy, which I hope you all know, and if you don't, I'll tell you about it. The city's language access policy, signed by Mayor Bloomberg in 2010, is focused on how city agencies in the city of New York provide direct services to New Yorkers. And when we're providing those direct services, ensuring that we provide them in the languages the New Yorkers most comfortably speak. So for our immigrant communities, where nearly half of New Yorkers speak a language other than English at home, where 1.8 million New Yorkers recognize themselves as limited English proficient, we in the city want to make sure that we're communicating in the languages individuals in our city most comfortably communicate in. So the city's language access policy really focuses on whether it's our school system, whether it's our Department of Health, and whether it's our small business services. How do we communicate with individuals in the languages they most comfortably speak? And so the same applies for our Department of Consumer Affairs. So for individuals who are taking licensing exams, they can take the exam in Spanish, they can take the exam in Mandarin, they can take the exam in Russian. They now can take it in Bengali and Urdu, which is really critical, because we are about how do we help our community succeed. So this organization in Queens was one of the recipients. Another was in Washington Heights, an organization that was working with childcare workers, and in particular individuals who were starting childcare centers in their home, daycare centers in their home, and getting them, both of whom were multilingual. They were working with the French-speaking West African community in Harlem. They were working with the Latino community in Washington Heights, and they were working with the fast-growing Chinese community that's blossoming in East Harlem. And so they were providing classes for this audience to better understand the licensing practices and the process by which, both through the Administration for Children's Services and the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, both of whom have to give you appropriate guidance and approval to run a home-based childcare center. So this was another example of how are immigrant entrepreneurs thriving and how do community-based organizations help these audiences thrive. Competition Thrive has been very successful. We actually launched a second initiative for it. We're in year 2 of it, and 5 different groups were recognized. This guidance this past year was really focused on technology. Who is helping our immigrant organizations better connect around the technological spectrum? And the irony here is many of our small businesses will tell us, we want to have websites, we want to participate in people being able to order food online, but we don't know how to. And we don't want to miss that market, we want to be a part of it. Many individuals who are immigrant entrepreneurs who are starting businesses, catering businesses from their home, they want to have a web presence, but they weren't sure how to do it. Lots of people know the success of iPad ads or apps, and they want to be able to sort of participate in that in what could be a very lucrative business. So the 5 organizations that have been identified in this round are focused specifically on those things, and we'll be evaluating them and announcing who's sort of the grand prize winner of that. So those are 2 of the third thing. And then the last one was this incubator. In New York, we actually have a tremendous number of immigrant entrepreneurs that are focused in the food arena. We have one of the largest audiences of Mexican food businesses that are creating tortillas and other things that could be exportable. In our Greek community, there are lots of small businesses that are sort of creating, whether it's the tzatziki or hummus or other things that can be exportable. Our Chinese community, you go into Flushing, Chinatown, there are lots of folks that are the creators now of wontons and dim sum and all these other things that are now exportable. And the same can be said for our Caribbean community and in our Russian community. The question is, where are they able to do those things that allows them to bring their businesses to scale. And so the City of New York has created incubator spaces. In Queens, there's actually an Incubator Kitchen. Up in East Harlem, there's also an Incubator Kitchen that is actually housed and run by an incredible group called Hot Bread Kitchen. And in Varick Street, it's actually more focused on sort of the technology. It could be around fashion. So the city really does care about how are immigrant entrepreneurs being able to cultivate their business strategy in a place that isn't their home, but actually is a place that allows them to grow their business to scale. And one other reality of the food businesses is actually that the City of New York, in partnership with Baruch, has now created a, I think it's fair to say, like a bit of a food competition. So all of these folks that do these large-scale food businesses can actually come and do a bit of an expose, and the City of New York will identify 3 or 4 of them and pay for them to be part of these larger big food conferences that happen at the Javits Center, and then connect them to the possibility of growing their businesses. So last year, Yorgos was the winner of this. It's actually, you can go into Whole Foods and find their tzatziki and their other things. But he used to work out of the Queens Incubator Kitchen, and he now has a contract with Whole Foods and is able to export his food across the city. Again, when we invest in our immigrant communities, they invest back in us. He's now employed a good number of people. He's been able to grow his business, and we see the direct benefits locally, right? More tax revenue, more business income, more success. So those are some very wonderful strategies that we've been able to support. Our Department of Small Business Services has done a really great amount of work in our immigrant communities. The last program I want to just mention is something called NBAT. It's New Business Acceleration Teams, and it is an initiative the administration took on, really recognizing from restaurant owners how hard it was to open a business in the city in some instances, and how it could actually be cumbersome when you're going to 4 or 5 different city agencies. And so we essentially took those 4 and 5 city agencies, we brought them together in one arena and said, you are now going to be responsible, and we focused on restaurants in particular, to go into these communities and help businesses streamline the process. So one person essentially project manages for a business how quickly you open a restaurant. We took the process from what could have been an 8-month process to a 2-month process, and it's been hugely successful. It's open and free to any and all who need it. The materials are available actually in Spanish and in English and in Mandarin. I'm not sure we have it up in Russian yet, but I can make sure that we circle back with all of you to make sure that we do that. So the city's constantly thinking about innovative ways that we support our immigrant small businesses because it's really critical. The last thing I want to just share is we have been able to provide guidance to cities across the country in this arena, not just on how do you support immigrants and their entrepreneurial spirit, but that actually is an incredibly important one, because the conversation on comprehensive immigration reform has largely focused on sort of what role will immigrants play. And I think through the mayor's voice, Mayor Bloomberg's voice nationally on the importance of immigrants and what they mean, the narrative across the country has now really recognized the role of immigrants and their ability as their voice economically for the country. So cities across America have now turned to New York and said, you know, how do we borrow some of what you guys have done? So our office has created something called Blueprints for Immigrant Integration. And we've done these blueprints in a number of arenas. So they're very beautiful and they look like this. We have worked with over 30 mayor's offices across the country where they have learned the importance of how do we in New York City invest in immigrant communities. And one of those arenas happens to be in economic development. And so this is actually a downloadable guide that cities across the country, but also you, can take a look at and better understand how do we, in the city, do this. And this is what I would say is a how-to guide that we help municipalities across the country understand that immigrants matter. You have to invest in immigrants, and how do you do it? And so it's not a secret New York wants to keep to itself. It actually is a secret we actually want cities across the country to invest in. Because again, when you invest in your communities, they invest in you. And so